Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another fireside chat. For today's parable, I want to go to Confucius. I realize we haven't done Confucius yet, and I thought, wow, it's about time. And so here's a great passage from the Analects. This is Book 11, Chapter 21 or 22. Oddly, I found both. It depends on the version that you get, so I'm not sure what's happening. But of course, with these ancient texts, you can run into this kind of problem. And he is walking with his apostle, I guess, or student, Chi-U. Sorry for the pronunciation of these names. And he's asked a series of questions he's asked the same question by a couple of different people. And so this is how it goes. Tse Lu asked whether he should immediately carry into practice what he heard. The master said, "There are your father and elder brothers to be consulted. Why should you act on that principle of immediately carrying into practice what you hear?" Zan Yu asked the same, whether he should immediately carry into practice what he heard. And the master answered, "Immediately carry into practice what you hear." Kung Shi said, "You asked whether he should carry immediately into practice what he heard, and you said, 'There are your father and elder brother consulted.' Chi-U asked whether he should immediately carry into practice what he heard, and you said, 'Carry it immediately into practice.' I, Chi-I, am perplexed and venture to ask you for an explanation." The master said, "Chi-U is retiring and slow, therefore I urge him forward. Yu has more than his own share of energy, therefore I kept him back." And this comes in, so there's a great parable there, just brief and short, but this comes at a huge dividing point between when you look at something like, the Christian tradition, the Roman tradition, the legalistic traditions all over the world, Islam, for instance, in various interpretations of this, but particularly in the Christian idea, is this notion that there is a moral, and the moral provides the answer, and the answer is the same for everyone. And one reason something like Confucianism or many other Asian philosophies, Hinduism also, by the way, strike us as difficult or perplexing if you come up from it from this direction, is that often, if not invariably, you get this much more subtle, much more complex, nuanced exploration of morals and ethical action. And so in this case, ask the same question. I've heard a piece of advice. I've gotten direction. Should I immediately act on it? And to one person, he says, no, you should consult your father and your elder brothers. And this seems very wise, like, you've got a proposition. You should go talk to your father and elder brothers about it. Okay, that's great. That makes perfect sense, particularly in the Confucius tradition, because you're supposed to consult with your older and wiser siblings and parents, of course, and father, most importantly. And then the next person comes along and says the same question and says, hey, should I, I've got this piece of advice, should I act on it? And he said, absolutely, you should act. And then when his disciple asks him about this, he just says very clearly, look, what is the correct course of action depends on the person you're talking to. So someone who is too aggressive, more, fly off the handle, ready to go, needs to be restrained a little bit and should probably double check. But someone who is quite retiring and too passive and too sensitive to changes and whatnot, well, they need to just go. And so the error or the action or the suggested action varies depending on the character, the moral quality, the capacities, the intellect, the background of the person you're talking to. There is no universal law per se. There's the idea that different people need different things at different times. And so what counts as wisdom on Wednesday at noon for Maurice does not count as wisdom on Friday at 7 for, Sally. Like these are not the same things, right? It doesn't work anymore. And so when you hear things like, the 10 Commandments, or this is the rule, or this is the law, which you hear, invariably, how many times in our lives, this suggests that you're in a different tradition. Again, it's hard for us to keep track of this because we're in a tradition where it's like, oh, these are the rules, this is the law, this is how things go, this is what you should do. And which, of course, every society has. So I'm not saying this is unique, but there's a huge layer in the philosophical tradition, particularly in Confucianism, where you're consistently trying to inquire about what is wise today for me, rather than what is wise universally for all time and all space for all people under all circumstances. This just seems like a silly question to them. This is not a helpful question. And it raises this notion because you have these people today complaining about like moral relativism. Oh, you want to be a moral relativist? And it's like, well, yeah, I guess, maybe, sure, because if you look at the works here of Confucius or other scholars, what you realize is like, yeah, we really do want to be moral relativists, that this makes a lot more sense than just laying down a rule and going, well, everybody has to follow this, and if you vary from that, then you're a bad person. If you fulfill it, you're a good person, even though we all know all the pitfalls and traps and that's not how the world really works, and so on and so forth. And yet we struggle with it because we don't have this more nuanced, or not, we don't have it, it does exist, but the emphasis is not there the way it is in Confucianism, that wisdom is a process of continual inquiry. It's not an answer, it's a process. The process is the answer. This process of asking, who am I today? Who is the person I'm speaking with today? What does wisdom look like within this context? And so we are I would say this highlights to me one of the powers of the Confucian tradition is this emphasis on continual inquiry, as opposed to trying to rationalize everything and create order and laws and rules out of, and then organize the chaos of life, the multifarious nature of life, underneath a small set of very strict interpretations. By the way, the Chinese tried to do this, had a whole tradition that tried to do this, legalists and Maoists, who leaned much more heavily in that direction, and finally they just kind of gave up. The tradition, by the way, is still influential. I may talk about this in another parable. But here you have it. And so when faced with moral perplexity or questions or these kinds of problems, I always like to remember Confucius thinking, oh, for me now today in my place, who am I, what's happening, and who are the people I'm talking to? Who am I speaking with? Are they the kind of people who can receive this message? What is the wisdom that is wisdom for them today at this time? And so it requires a much deeper level of reflection and intimate knowledge of the people. And this is the last point I want to emphasize here, is when you get something like a moral code that is written down in 10 commandments, what you're doing is you're homogenizing people, and you're saying everybody is functionally the same, and so they all have to do these same things in the same way at the same time, as opposed to asking a much greater question or a much larger, more fundamental question. But that requires, if in this case, knowing the individuals you're talking to. So the Confucian system is really a sort of one wise person to a few people. It can be applied more broadly, of course, but it keeps having this emphasis of knowing people, of knowing who they are, knowing what their merits are, knowing what their demerits are, knowing what they're good at or bad at, right? All these sorts of knowledge, that it doesn't just say, like, everybody is the same. Like, I'm just going to wipe the slate. You're all the same. Here's the rules for everybody. Now everybody follow those. That's wisdom. That's goodness. That's salvation. It's like, well, I don't really know who this person is, so it's hard for me to judge what would be best for them. And just being able to say that, which is very implicit in this passage and in others in Confucianism, whereas this notion of, oh, if I know you, then I can give wise advice. The flip side of that is, well, if I don't know you and I don't know anything about you, it's difficult. And this is why you'll see over and over again, Confucius says things like, oh, well, you should consult your father and your elder brothers, right? These sorts of, listen to the wise people. And it's kind of it has this experience of almost, it feels a bit like buck passing, right? Like, oh, well, I don't want to take responsibility for this. I don't know. But the flip side of that is like, yeah, you're saying, I don't know because I don't know enough about the situation. I don't know enough about the people. And that notion of wisdom being impart the knowledge to know when you don't know enough to comment. This is almost unheard of, because if your God is all-knowing and all-seeing, then this can't in theory happen. But in this case, and in the Confucian tradition particularly, also you get this in the Taoist tradition, that not unrelated, of course, influence each other over the millennia, you end up with just a very different flavor. And that's what I think is important about this passage, besides just the idea of the message for different people. It is that flavor of, oh, yeah, there are different messages for different people, and wisdom is not a universal law written on a piece of stone that is true forever. And in some ways, I think the Western philosophical obsession with ontology, which I believe is almost entirely misleading and sort of has created all kinds of problems for Western philosophy, arises from that desire, from that wanting to have the rule, the truth, the knowledge, the end point, be done with it all, as opposed to the like, different places, different times, different people require different ideas, and sometimes we just don't know. That is fundamentally, this is a huge challenge to the traditional Western view, both of philosophy and of morals. So a short passage there, chapter either 21 or 22, depending on the version that you get, of book 11 of the Analects. Very, very interesting, very short, somewhat confusing in the way it's written, but I think the message is pretty clear. And its challenge to our worldview is pretty profound in some ways. Thank you very much.